It started with a scream, one of those glass-shattering, lung-shredding shrieks that makes you think someone's being murdered. I dropped my coffee, sprinted to the front yard, and found Karen in a silk bathrobe and kitten heels, standing on my driveway like she'd discovered a corpse. But what she was pointing at, wild-eyed and trembling, wasn't blood. It was a surveyor's flag poking out of the ground near her flower bed. She was shrieking at it like it had insulted her mother. Behind her, half a dozen men in reflective vests were trudging around my property with GPS rods and clipboard. One of them looked up, saw me, and said the words that cracked open the insanity to come. "Morning. We're just confirming your boundary lines. Looks like your neighbor's house sits about 12 feet into your lot." I stared at him, then at Karen's massive faux Tuscan monstrosity, perched like a tan tumor across my tree line. I've owned this land for 15 years. It was my sanctuary after quitting the corporate world. 3 wooded acres, a humble 2-bedroom cabin I'd built with my own hands, and peace so thick you could bottle it. The HOA, technically called Sycamore Hills Preservation Society, because neighborhood dictatorship didn't fit on a welcome sign, had formed 3 years ago when a luxury subdivision popped up on the adjacent hill. Karen, their president, declared that my land was in the community's aesthetic purview, even though I never signed anything. That was the beginning of the passive-aggressive letters, the citations for things like non-uniform gravel, and the time she threatened to fine me for having a hammock. But I never imagined she'd build an entire house on my land. That's not exaggeration. Her property line had been wrong since day one, surveyed off a preliminary plat that had never been filed correctly. Her builders either didn't care or were bribed to ignore it. 12 feet might not sound like much, but in that strip of land were my maple trees, a portion of my well's access trench, and most importantly, my driveway. Which meant that every time Karen's Mercedes left her garage, it drove over my dirt. Karen, red-faced and vibrating like a washing machine, marched up to me as I inspected the surveyor's clipboard. "This is a mistake," she hissed. "My home was approved by the HOA and the county. You can't just change boundaries because you feel like it." I wanted to laugh. "Karen, your entire garage is on my land. That's not a feeling. That's GPS." She narrowed her eyes like she was debating whether to slap me or call the police. Instead, she pivoted, stormed back to her house, and slammed the door so hard her fake shutters fell off. I thought that was the end of it. I thought, naively, that she'd realize she'd made a mistake and quietly arranged to fix it. Instead, 2 days later, I received a letter taped to my front door. "Dear Mr. Prescott," it read, "this is a formal notice that your presence on HOA land is in violation of Sycamore Hills preservation bylaws. You are to vacate your dwelling within 10 business days or be subject to fines and potential legal action. Sincerely, Karen Welling, HOA President." I reread the letter 3 times, then laughed so hard I nearly fell off my porch. She wasn't denying her mistake, she was doubling down on it, claiming that my entire property now belonged to the HOA because her house accidentally squatted on it. That's like parking in someone's yard and then evicting them for trespassing. I scanned the letterhead and noticed she'd included a legal firm, Welkin and Reese. A quick online search revealed it was her cousin's practice, mostly specializing in dog bite settlements and minor real estate paperwork. It was laughable, but now it was war. I didn't respond directly. I called a real lawyer, one who didn't list emotional distress after tanning bed malfunctions under his practice areas. We pulled the original deed, the survey plats, the county zoning permits, and every photo I'd taken over the past decade of my property line. Then we filed a cease and desist order, an official claim of encroachment, and a quiet title action. The paper trail alone was a fortress, but I knew Karen wouldn't go quietly. A week later, I came home from the store to find a uniformed man standing in my driveway beside a city truck. He was holding a clipboard, looking confused. "You John Prescott?" he asked. I nodded. He showed me a permit request, filed by the HOA, for demolition of an illegally placed cabin structure. I blinked at him. They tried to have my house demolished? He shook his head slowly. Doesn't make sense. This isn't even HOA jurisdiction. I told him I'd need to verify ownership. Sorry for the scare. I thanked him and walked straight to my barn, where I opened the hidden compartment in the floorboards and pulled out an old folder. Drone footage. A friend of mine had used his drone to shoot an overhead video of my land last summer. In the footage, you could see the clear border between my property and Karen's under-construction home. Timestamped. Geotagged. Irrefutable. I uploaded everything to a flash drive, marched over to the county clerk's office, and submitted it as evidence with the pending claim. The clerk raised an eyebrow. You sure you want to go through with this? This could force a tear-down order. I'm counting on it, I said. 2 days later, Karen showed up at my porch. No letter, no lawyer, no threats, just her and a Tupperware of what looked like lemon bars. Her smile was so strained it could have cracked porcelain. I thought maybe we could talk this out neighbor to neighbor, she said, her voice sticky with fake warmth. I leaned against my doorframe. Sure. You want to move your house? She blinked. That's not what I meant. I didn't take the lemon bars. The next morning, I found a plastic for sale sign hammered into the edge of my driveway, with her number on it. I pulled it out and replaced it with a bright orange notice of legal dispute. But the kicker came 2 nights later. I heard engines, looked outside, and saw a moving truck backed into Karen's garage. 2 men were hauling out boxes. At first I thought she was giving up. Then I saw her supervising with a glass of wine in one hand and a stack of printed flyers in the other. The flyers said, "Open house this Saturday, full renovation, motivated seller." She was trying to sell the house, the one illegally built on my land. While under litigation, I took pictures, called my lawyer, and smiled so hard my face hurt. Because Karen didn't realize that what she'd just done, trying to sell a property with a known title defect, was fraud. And now, she wasn't just dealing with me. She was about to get a visit from someone a whole lot meaner. Someone from the state attorney's office. Karen's open house was a disaster even before I got involved. I would have felt bad for her, if she wasn't actively trying to sell a house built on stolen land that included my driveway, my trees, and a portion of my well trench. But karma had a head start. By the time I strolled over that Saturday, she was already losing her grip. I caught her barking at a pair of elderly looky-loos for walking through the hydrangeas wrong, while a teenage real estate agent looked like she was trying to melt into the stucco siding. I stayed off to the side, sipping lemonade and watching the chaos unfold from my lawn chair like it was community theater. The best part was how none of the potential buyers could park in the driveway. Because technically that was my land. And I'd blocked it with a line of orange cones and a laminated sign that read, "Private property, survey dispute in progress." You'd think that would scare people off. But some buyers love drama, especially when they think they can get a luxury property cheap. Karen kept insisting it was a paperwork issue and that everything would be resolved in a few days, but you could tell from the forced grin and vein pulsing in her temple that she was ready to scream. I didn't approach her directly that day. I didn't need to. I just made sure everyone got a copy of the drone footage printed on glossy photo paper with the caption, "Notice, this structure encroaches on private land. Legal action pending." I handed them out like party favors. One guy actually asked for 2 so he could show his wife. Karen caught wind around hour 3 and came marching toward me like a rhinoceros in heels. "You're tanking my sale," she shrieked, jabbing her acrylic nail at my chair. "This is harassment." I looked up, calm as ever. "Nope. Just exercising my right to inform potential buyers about the legal status of my property. It's called due diligence." "You're not a lawyer," she spat. "No," I agreed, standing up and pointing toward the end of the street, "but she is." That's when my attorney, Dana, pulled up in her hybrid SUV, stepped out in a blazer and jeans combo that screamed unbothered professional, and walked right past Karen without blinking. Dana handed me a manila envelope and said, "County Clerk approved expedited proceedings. We're fast-tracking the injunction." Karen's face collapsed in real time. "You can't do that. That house is worth $800,000. Dana smiled politely. "Then you should have built it on your own land." 2 days later, a sheriff's deputy showed up at Karen's door with a clipboard, a notice of injunction, and an order to immediately halt any attempts to sell, renovate, or lease the property pending resolution of the boundary dispute. I watched from my porch as Karen tried to argue with the officer, but his expression didn't change once. He just pointed to the form and asked if she'd like to sign now or be served again with court costs. She signed. For the next week, it was eerily quiet. No moving trucks, no wine-fueled HOA meetings, no new threats taped to my door. I'd almost started to relax, until a county inspector knocked on my cabin door with a serious look on his face. "You John Prescott?" he asked. Again with the clipboard. "That's me," I said, bracing myself. He explained that someone had submitted a complaint alleging I'd installed unlicensed waste disposal equipment on my land. I blinked at him. "You mean my compost heap?" He shook his head. "No, sir. According to this report, you've buried a septic tank too close to the water table." Now I did laugh. "That's my old root cellar. It's lined with stone and it's older than both of us put together. There's no tank. No plumbing. You want to check it?" He did. I walked him down to the root cellar, opened the door, and let him climb down. He looked around with a flashlight, sniffed the air, and came back up 5 minutes later looking irritated. "Somebody's messing with you," he muttered. I nodded. "Her name's Karen." He filed it as a false report, but the damage was done. I knew now she was trying a new strategy, death by paperwork. Over the next 3 weeks, I was visited by a fire marshal anonymous report of illegal burns, the Environmental Health Department, unpermitted livestock, my dog, and even animal control, a dangerous raccoon infestation, which turned out to be 3 squirrels fighting over a walnut. Each visit ended the same way. Official shrugs, apologies, and me waving goodbye with a clipboard of my own. I documented everything. Every false report, every visit, every complaint. I built a timeline with timestamps and cross-referenced footage from the trail cams I'd installed around my property. Then I handed it all to Dana, who smiled like it was Christmas morning. We filed a countersuit for harassment and malicious prosecution. But that was just the beginning. Because while Karen was busy trying to bury me under bureaucracy, she'd overlooked one tiny, important fact. The county assessor had finally finished reviewing my complaint. Turns out, when you build your house partially on someone else's land, your entire tax parcel becomes invalid. And when you falsify documents to get a building permit, that becomes fraudulent conveyance. The assessor flagged the entire property for re-evaluation, and that triggered an audit. Now, I wasn't there when the county officials showed up at Karen's house with measuring wheels, clipboards, and cameras, but I did see the aftermath. Karen pacing on her front lawn in house slippers and a robe, yelling into 2 different phones while waving a folder that looked like it was melting in her hand. She looked like someone had just repossessed her crown. Later that evening, I received an anonymous letter in my mailbox. No return address, no signature, just a single sheet of paper that said, "You've made a powerful enemy. Enjoy it while it lasts." I rolled my eyes and tossed it on the firewood pile. Then came the HOA meeting. Karen, despite the mounting chaos, still ran monthly HOA meetings like a mini courtroom. But this one was different. I wasn't supposed to be there. I wasn't a member, but a few friendly neighbors tipped me off and invited me in as their guest. I sat in the back, hat pulled low, listening. Karen stood at the podium in a red pantsuit like a dictator clinging to the last shreds of control. She talked about protecting community standards and threats to harmony, and then started reading from a resolution she'd clearly written herself, demanding emergency funds from the HOA reserve to cover legal contingencies. That's when one of the board members, A retired librarian named Ruth, who wore bifocals like a sword, raised her hand and said, "Karen, are you asking us to pay for your personal lawsuit with HOA money?" Karen tried to spin it, but it didn't work. Ruth pulled out her own copy of the injunction and read aloud the county's summary of encroachment. "It says here your house is not only illegally built, but you knowingly misrepresented the parcel lines. That's fraud." Karen stammered something about community investment, but the board wasn't buying it. They voted, right there, in front of everyone, not to authorize funds. 2 people abstained. The rest said no. Karen's face turned the color of cherry lipstick left in a microwave. As she stormed out, I stood up and said, just loud enough to be heard, "Sounds like eviction's still on the table." The land developer's name was Curtis Harlan, and I found him living 3 states over in a retirement community with a koi pond and a full-time golf cart valet. Curtis was in his late 70s, sharp as a razor, and only too happy to talk once I mentioned Sycamore Hills and the HOA president who had built her McMansion on my driveway. He'd sold off the land years ago after a series of disputes with the local planning board and had since made a quiet fortune flipping resort parcels out west. But he still had copies of the original development records, and when I told him what Karen had done, building illegally, claiming ownership, trying to evict me, he let out a wheezy chuckle and said, "That woman always struck me as the kind who'd steal your pen, then accuse you of fraud for writing in your own notebook." What Curtis had was gold. Original blueprints, plat maps, environmental impact assessments, and, most importantly, a restrictive covenant he'd quietly filed before the HOA was ever created. According to this document, the entire Sycamore Hills subdivision had a clause baked into the land title. If any structure encroached on adjacent property by more than 8 feet and wasn't corrected within a year of discovery, the lot owner could forfeit legal claim to the structure in question. In simple terms, if you built your house on someone else's land and didn't fix it fast, you could lose it. Not just the land, the whole house. It was a developer's insurance policy against exactly the kind of HOA power grabs Karen had turned into an art form. The kicker? Karen's house extended nearly 12 feet over my line. And it had been that way for 3 years. I had Dana review the covenant, cross-reference it with our court filings, and file a motion to enforce the forfeiture clause. And just like that, the case moved from a land dispute to something a whole lot spicier, a full-blown property seizure. Karen found out the morning her lawyer got served with the new filing. I wasn't there when she heard, but I heard about the screaming. Multiple neighbors reported it. One even called animal control because they thought a mountain lion was trapped in her garage. The sound she made when she realized I was going for her entire house must have been unholy. She came to my cabin the next day, wild-eyed and flanked by 2 men in matching polo shirts that read, HOA Compliance Enforcement. It would have been funny if it weren't so desperate. "You have to stop this," she hissed, stepping onto my porch like it wasn't crawling with motion-activated cameras. "This is my home. My investment. You don't want to be the reason a woman loses everything, do you?" I stared at her. "Karen, you tried to have my cabin demolished. You tried to sell a house built on land you don't own. You filed 7 false reports against me in 1 month. You don't get to play the victim now." She turned red, then pale, then red again. "Fine. What do you want? Money? A settlement?" I crossed my arms. "I want you off my land." "But where am I supposed to go?" she asked, and for a split second, I almost saw the fear behind her manic energy. Almost. "I hear the retirement village in Brighton Lakes has a pool," I said, then closed the door. The court hearing was set for 2 weeks later. Karen filed an emergency injunction to delay it, but the judge, clearly unimpressed with the pile of petty filings and the evidence of her bad faith actions, denied it. That's when Karen made her next move. One last Hail Mary that I genuinely didn't see coming. She forged a document. Or, more accurately, she altered an existing one, A copy of the deed transfer from Curtis Harlan's original land sale, with a page added that claimed she'd purchased an additional buffer strip of land between our properties. It was a laughably bad fake. The font didn't match. The notary's stamp was upside down. And the witness signature was just K. Welling in loopy cursive, which might have been subtle if she herself weren't Karen Welling. But it was enough to slow things down. Dana filed a motion to examine the document and requested forensic analysis. While we waited, I braced for another wave of chaos. Instead, things got quiet. Too quiet. Then, one morning, I woke up to find bulldozers. Not on my land, next to it. Karen had hired a crew to start digging a community dog park on an empty parcel owned by the HOA. She claimed it was outreach, a goodwill effort to make peace with the neighborhood and restore harmony. But we all knew what it was. A distraction, a stunt, and also a bribe. She started throwing weekly barbecues, HOA funded, face painting, free hot dogs, petting zoos. It was like she was trying to Disneyland her way back into people's good graces. And it actually started to work. Some of the neighbors softened. Others were just there for the free ribs. But the shift was palpable. Then I got a call from Ruth, the retired librarian who'd called Karen out at the HOA meeting. She's holding a secret vote, Ruth said. Trying to change the bylaws to retroactively approve all construction variances, including encroachments. If she succeeded, it could undermine our case. We needed to stop it. But I wasn't going to march in and throw a fit. That's not how I play. Instead, I got Curtis on a video call and asked him to attend the vote virtually. He still held a tiny sliver of land rights to Sycamore Hills due to a weird loophole in the subdivision's original structure. Enough that, legally, he could demand a seat at the board. And with Ruth's help, we used HOA rules against her. When the meeting began, Ruth motioned to suspend standard procedure due to unresolved litigation, then introduced Curtis as a proxy board member. The look on Karen's face when Curtis appeared on the projector was the kind of thing you bottle and sell as instant karma. Karen, he said, adjusting his glasses, I don't know what game you think you're playing, but this isn't how grown-ups settle property disputes. Karen tried to argue. Curtis ignored her. Ruth called for a vote to delay all bylaw changes until legal matters were resolved. It passed. Karen was cornered, publicly shamed, legally trapped, and yet she still had one last wild card. One final tantrum that made every previous move look tame. The night before the court date, someone broke into my barn. Cut the lock, broke a few lights, rifled through my files. They didn't take anything, just left everything scattered like a warning. But they also missed the hidden camera I'd installed under the rafters. I watched the footage 3 times. It was Karen. No mask. No gloves. Just her and a flashlight, pacing like a raccoon in a trash bin. I turned the footage over to Dana. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. She just added it to the case file and said, "We're asking for full damages." The morning of the hearing, Karen showed up with a new lawyer, a tired man in a shiny suit who looked like he'd lost before he even sat down. The judge, stern, unimpressed, and holding a copy of the surveillance footage, let Karen's team sputter through half a dozen objections before dropping the gavel and ruling in our favor. Karen's house, built knowingly and illegally on land she did not own, was forfeited under the terms of the covenant. And effective immediately, the entire structure was now mine. Not just the land. The whole damn house. When the judge ruled that Karen's entire house was now legally mine, the courtroom didn't erupt. It cracked like ice under pressure. For a few seconds, there was stunned silence. Karen didn't even gasp. She just sat there blinking, like her brain had unplugged from the reality around her. Then, in slow motion, her mouth opened and she whispered, "That's not fair," before her face crumpled into a slow-motion meltdown. Her new lawyer patted her shoulder and immediately asked for an appeal, which the judge dismissed with the driest of tones. "You may file, but I wouldn't spend money on it." Then he banged the gavel, and it was done. Karen had spent years building her palace on someone else's dirt, and now I owned it. Outside the courthouse, Dana turned to me with the faintest smirk. "Congratulations, John. You just became the proud owner of a house you'll probably never want to live in." She wasn't wrong. The place was a gaudy, over-customized temple of suburban excess. Columns that didn't hold anything, chandeliers the size of small planets, granite in every room like someone had a bulk deal with a quarry. It wasn't me. But that wasn't the point. This wasn't about living in it. It was about winning the war, and deciding what to do next. As for Karen, she was losing altitude fast. By the time she returned to what was now my house, the locks had already been changed, and a legal notice had been duct-taped to her beloved mahogany front door. She stood on the curb for nearly an hour, arms crossed, pacing and dialing furiously. The neighbors watched from their porches, peeking through blinds and sipping drinks like it was the best reality TV episode they'd ever seen. But then, Karen being Karen, she didn't go quietly. That night, at 2:17 a.m., my phone buzzed with an alert from the motion cameras. I opened the app and there she was, dressed in a hoodie and pajama pants, trying to sneak through the backyard like a toddler playing burglar. She made it to the back patio and tried every window. When that failed, she started screaming at the house. Full banshee mode. I'm not exaggerating. She yelled at the walls like they'd betrayed her. Called the kitchen a traitorous granite tomb. Blamed the garage door for taking his side. Finally, she kicked a patio chair and burst into tears. I called the sheriff's office. When they arrived, she tried to convince them that she was being harassed, that I had broken into her home, and that it was all some massive clerical error. The deputy asked if she had a copy of the deed. She didn't. I did. They gave her a choice: leave voluntarily or be escorted. She left, sobbing into her phone. The next morning, I stood in the entryway of the house I now legally owned, staring up at a grand staircase Karen had once bragged about having custom designed based on something she saw in a reality show. I walked from room to room, documenting everything, just in case she tried to accuse me of damaging anything. And that's when I found it. In the home office, behind a faux leather binder labeled HOA Records, was a second folder. Inside? Receipts. Lots of them. But not just for construction or utilities. These were from HOA funds, checks written for personal purchases, vacations, gift cards, and even Botox. Some of them were made out to her cousin's fake law firm. Others were billed to contractors who didn't exist. She'd been siphoning money from the HOA for years under the noses of everyone, disguising the embezzlement as community beautification and emergency council expenses. I didn't hesitate. I called Ruth. She arrived within the hour, holding a thermos of black coffee and wearing a windbreaker like she was on her way to uncover Watergate. We spread the documents across the marble kitchen island. She always said the HOA was underfunded, Ruth muttered, flipping through fake invoices. That's why we couldn't fix the tennis court drainage. That's why the security cameras at the clubhouse never worked. Turns out, I said, Karen was the emergency. Ruth didn't waste time. She called an emergency HOA meeting that same afternoon. And this time the turnout was huge. Even the quiet neighbors, people I'd never seen speak more than 5 words, showed up with folding chairs and popcorn. Karen, to her credit, still showed up too. Dressed in black slacks, a silk blouse, and a thin layer of desperation. She tried to call the meeting to order like nothing had happened. "This isn't a trial," she said. "We need to move forward as a community." Then Ruth stepped forward, dropped the folder on the table, and said, "We are moving forward. Without you." The silence was deafening. Karen tried to snatch the folder, but 2 other board members blocked her. Ruth read aloud. Itemized misappropriation of HOA funds, falsified invoices, evidence of self-dealing. Then she introduced a resolution to remove Karen from the board entirely and permanently bar her from any financial access. The vote passed unanimously. Karen stood frozen, blinking like she'd been unplugged again. You can't fire me, she whispered. Karen, Ruth said flatly, this isn't a job. It's a neighborhood. Karen left that meeting under a blanket of glares. But the final nail came 3 days later when she filed for bankruptcy. Turns out she'd leveraged herself to the teeth with private loans, assuming her house would keep climbing in value forever. But now it wasn't hers. She'd lost her position, her power, and her property. Me? I didn't keep the house. I sold it. Not out of spite, okay, maybe a little out of spite, but mostly because I didn't want to spend the rest of my life vacuuming a stairway I'd always hated. I used the profits to upgrade my cabin, added solar, fixed the roof, rebuilt the porch swing Karen once called a public eyesore. Then I donated a portion of the sale to the community fund, earmarked for restoring the HOA clubhouse that had fallen into disrepair under Karen's reign. As for Karen, she moved into a rental about 10 miles away. Rumor had it she tried to join another HOA and was immediately blacklisted after her name came up on a regional management forum. She started a Facebook group called Citizens Against Property Tyranny, which is still somehow just her and one guy who thinks Wi-Fi causes arthritis. I didn't take pleasure in her downfall, not the kind she'd taken in trying to ruin my life. But I did enjoy the peace, the quiet, the return of birdsong and wind chimes, and the sound of my dog barking at squirrels instead of compliance officers. People ask me if I ever miss the drama. I don't. But every now and then, when I see a new car slowly creeping down our street, windows down, obviously house shopping, I smile and think, you should have seen what used to be here. And I mean it. Because once, right there on that concrete driveway, stood the kingdom of Karen. And now? Now it's mine. Spring rolled around like it always did, soft light, longer days, and everything starting to bloom again, including the community's sense of normalcy. Karen had vanished. Her name still floated around in neighborhood conversations like an urban legend, but her physical presence had been wiped clean. The new owners of the house, my former house, were a quiet couple in their 60s who gardened more than they spoke. I liked them immediately. They even asked if it was okay to remove the columned faux balcony that served no purpose. I told them to take a sledgehammer to it and gave them my old one. We laughed. We shook hands. We never once talked about Karen. I was back to my life, simple, steady, full of projects that didn't involve lawsuits or restraining orders. I built a new greenhouse, restored my fence, and installed a proper gate with a keypad and cameras. Not for security anymore, but for peace of mind. That sense of control over your own land, your own life, it was priceless. But I wasn't quite done with the saga. There was still one thread left dangling, and it came back into focus one day in a bright blue envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photo, a shot of my cabin taken from a distance. No note, no signature, just a timestamp in the corner from 3 nights ago. At first, I assumed it was junk, a prank maybe. But the angle was too familiar. It was taken from the woods near the back of my property, an area I'd just cleared of brush. Only one person would have known that spot. I sighed, pocketed the photo, and poured a coffee. An hour later, the sheriff's deputy knocked. "Karen's been arrested," he said, leaning against his cruiser. "Credit card fraud, wire fraud, and a bunch of mail tampering charges." I blinked. "Mail tampering?" He nodded. "Looks like she was rerouting HOA documents to herself for months. She tried to claim someone forged her name on financial transfers, said she was being framed." "She frame herself?" I asked. "Effectively, yeah," he said with a half-smile. "Also, she filed a fake deed in another county trying to claim she still owned your land. It flagged in the system because of the pending title case. She's facing felony charges now." The law had finally caught up, and this time it wasn't me behind the paperwork. But what really hit me was how quiet she'd gone in the end. Karen hadn't stormed back in with protest signs or lawsuit. She hadn't barged into HOA meetings with fresh threat. No. She'd crept around the shadows, faking documents and filing fraudulent claims, because for once she knew she couldn't win by force. She tried to win by deceit. It failed. The last we heard of her officially was when she pled no contest and received a sentence that included community service, probation, and mandatory psychological counseling. She didn't contest it. She didn't show up in court with fire in her eyes. From what Dana told me, she looked like someone whose empire had quietly crumbled from within. The HOA held a barbecue a few months later to celebrate the start of a new summer. Ruth handed me a paper plate piled with brisket and said, "Never thought I'd say this, but I actually like our neighborhood now." She motioned around, kids playing cornhole, someone's golden retriever trying to steal a burger, actual laughter instead of tension. "Feels human again." I nodded. "Yeah. No rulers. No tyrants. Just neighbors," she said. Then she handed me a sealed envelope and said, "By the way, open that later." I waited until I got home. Inside was a single-page motion, signed unanimously by the HOA board, honorary exemption for life. I was officially free from any and all HOA oversight. No dues. No complaints. No citations. Just pure, unrestricted living on my own land. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped it in my pond. But it wasn't just symbolic. Karen had tried to evict me from my own home. She'd tried to erase my presence, replace it with her own version of what order should look like. And in doing so, she'd exposed a truth no one in that neighborhood had ever questioned. HOAs aren't supposed to be kingdoms. They're supposed to be cooperative. And if you let the wrong person hold the pen, they'll redraw the map to crown themselves queen. I spent that fall writing everything down, not out of vengeance but because people need to know these things happen. That one entitled person can weaponize paper and power, and that if you don't push back smartly, they'll smother you in red tape and call it civic duty. But also, I wrote it because I knew someone else, somewhere, might one day need to know how to fight back. And then, about a year later, I got an email from someone I didn't recognize. The subject line just said, "You don't know me, but I live 2 states over. And we've got a Karen problem." I called him. Turns out, word had spread. My story, bits of it anyway, had made the rounds through online forums, neighborhood groups, and HOA horror story thread. This guy was a retired engineer whose new neighbor had started an HOA from scratch and was trying to claim authority over adjacent properties. He wanted advice, help, guidance. I gave him everything, and when he won, because he did win, he sent me a photo, a small bronze plaque nailed to a wooden post near his mailbox. It read, "This property is HOA resistant. Thanks, John Prescott." I laughed so hard I snorted coffee up my nose. That's how I knew Karen hadn't won, even if she still wandered around somewhere with a spreadsheet and a grudge. Her empire didn't just fall, it sparked a resistance. The HOA was no longer a sword. It was a shield. And people were finally learning how to wield it right. A few months ago, I was sitting on my rebuilt porch swing, now with reinforced chains and a strategically placed beer cooler, when a new couple walked up the lane with a folded neighborhood brochure. They looked nervous, uncertain. "Is it true," the husband asked, "that the HOA used to run people off this land?" I took a sip from my glass. "Used to. And someone stopped them?" I glanced toward the trees. Toward the faint ghost of a tan McMansion that used to cast a shadow across my morning light. "Yeah," I said. "Someone did." They smiled, thanked me, and moved on. A moment later, my dog barked at a squirrel. The wind chimes kicked in. Peace resumed. I leaned back, feet up, mind clear. Karen once told me I didn't belong in her neighborhood. Funny thing is, she was the one who never owned it to begin with.